Thanks for joining me on episode 1129 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
I'm Jeff Wald. I challenge you to invest in yourself, invest in others, develop your influence, and impact the world by using your time, your talent, and your treasures to live out your calling. Having the ability to focus on how your work impacts the world is key, and one way to be inspired. To do that is to listen to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend, Scott Mader.
But the truth is, all I work with on people is talent. Because at the end of the day, the way you handle your time and the way you handle your treasures is all about how you handle yourself. And that's the core similarity between mentorship, coaching, and counseling. They're all focused on that area of how you handle yourself.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about developing your influence through stewarding your talent, I talk with you about the difference between a mentor, a coach, and a counselor. I also talk about why you may want all of these things in your life. And I also talk with you about the reason these things may be real keys to growing in your life.
You've heard me talk about developing your talent, and one of the best ways to do that is through books. But if you're like most people today, it's hard to find the time to read. And that's why today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Go to inspiredstewardship.com/audible to sign up, and you can get a 30-day free trial. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from, and you can pick one and listen your way to developing your talents via Audible. That's inspiredstewardship.com/audible to get your free trial and listen to great books the same way you're listening to this podcast.
Mentor, coach, or counselor. What are these things and why might we want them in our life? You'll see different definitions of all three of these in different places, but broadly speaking, usually you'll hear about mentorship is when someone who's more experienced in a particular job or career offers some sort of advice, usually informally, though it can be formally, to someone with less experience. In other words, it's helping someone come along in their job. Coaching is generally defined as something that's somewhat short-term, though again, short-term is relative. I've worked with clients for 10 or more years in some cases. It tends to be formal and structured. It tends to be specific and measurable, and it's focused on performance. What's more, coaching is generally a collaborative process where the coach and the client are working together to develop areas around the growth of the client. Generally, coaches are not looked at as having all the answers or giving advice, but rather gathering information and helping the client through a process of change. Mentoring tends to be longer term and informal. It tends to be driven by development or focused on career or job. And it has usually much looser parameters for growth. Mentorship is usually about developing a coworker about something else. And then, of course, for counseling, as a coach, this is an area that we need to be very careful to not stray into, because counseling generally requires credentialing and is focused on certain types of things, not just mental health. A lot of times people think counselors are only focused on mental illness or that kind of thing, but counseling can actually be much more than that. Counselors have very strict rules that they operate under in terms of confidentiality and in terms of sort of privilege. In other words, as a coach, what I say with a client could actually be subpoenaed and put into a court of law, but as a counselor, it's usually much more protected. Now, I will tell you, as a coach, I still hold things that the client tells me in confidence, but that's just part of my coaching expectations or coaching agreement with the client. Counselors often have much firmer boundaries around their interactions with their clients as well. For counseling, it tends to be a retrospective or backwards looking kind of process. Generally, the client has some sort of decreased level of functioning. Now, that doesn't necessarily, again, mean mental illness, but there's a structural or behavioral problem that they're trying to work on. Oftentimes, counseling may involve collaborative care with medical professionals that may even involve medicine. It's deeply oriented towards figuring out why something is happening, and it can be relatively long term. It requires certain licensing and training, and it is diagnostic. It is focused on finding out what is wrong so that you can work on healing that through medicine or through behavioral types of therapy. It's about recovering from the past traumas and releasing and relieving psychological suffering. It's often stigmatized, but really shouldn't be. Where coaching is more focused on the perspective or the forward looking. It's focused on a solution and change or a capacity for change. It tends to be goal oriented and co-created. It's not diagnostic, but it helps the client clarify their goals and how to go about reaching them. Now, the truth is, in all three of these cases, you may need all of these in your life at various times. I've worked with a lot of counselors who see the value of coaching and actually have even partnered with some of them and worked. I've worked as a coach and they've worked as a counselor with the client on the same thing. So for instance, I've had some clients that have had addiction or other issues like that. And it becomes very clear in my coaching that they need to work with a counselor on some of their past trauma to be able to reset and overcome that trauma. And they can continue to work with me as a coach on trying to achieve their goals and having accountability and those sorts of benefits that coaching can give while working with a counselor. I've also had clients that are working with a mentor at their day job, getting better at their career. But as a coach, I'm working with them on broader goals around their life and their why and their mindset and their beliefs, and how those things can help them, not just in their career, but in their relationships and in their broader structure. As a stewardship coach, I work with people on their time, their talent, and their treasures so that they can live out their calling. But the truth is, I joke all the time about the fact that people come to me for help around their time or their treasures, either with that feeling of I make too much money to be this broke, or with the feeling of I get a lot of things done, but I have way too much to do, and I end up sacrificing the things that feel like they're the most important to get things done that I feel like I have to do, and I don't know how to balance that. But the truth is, all I work with on people is talent, because at the end of the day, the way you handle your time and the way you handle your treasures is all about how you handle yourself. And that's the core similarity between mentorship, coaching, and counseling. They're all focused on that area of how you handle yourself. It's just mentoring is focused on that career part of yourself. Counselors are focused on looking at the past so that you can recover from trauma and past problems. And coaches tend to be focused on the future and how your capacity for change and growth can allow you to change what you're doing today so that your future becomes better. All three are valuable, all three are necessary, and all three can actually work together to allow you to really grow and thrive in your life. That's why I love being a coach, because it's about forward focus. It's about growth and thriving. It's about accountability on the things that you most want out of your life. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of talent, you can go over to inspiredstewardship.com/talent and sign up for our 5-week series on the stewardship of talent. Or if you're in the U.S., you can text 44222 talent tips. That's talent tips to 44222 and get those tips. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.